You do have a way.
Well. Buenas tardes. We know that we have a full agenda, and one of the easy answer that I found to introduce everybody that is here is like we went ahead and sent you the short bio and the full program, so you don't need to hear me reading this. So I just want to say that Mark is a good friend. We met a couple years ago in Costa Rica. We at La Salle University there, and after that I participated as a student in one of the workshops that Mark was leading for activists and teachers, and many people that work in different settings at the University of Peace outside of San Jose. And I always was dreaming like, when is that I will have the opportunity to invite Mark to be, near the areas that I am working. I failed to bring you to Monteverde, Costa Rica when we were there, but we are so happy that you joined us here at Pendo Hill. So welcome, and you have the next hour and a half, I think.
Hour and 45 minutes.
Oh! You see,
I count. Okay, so maybe before I begin, just kind of give a little bit some of my connection to liberation theology, so it might not be obvious. So, I did my undergrad in math with a minor in physics. So what do you do when you do your undergrad? You immediately go off to Peru for 8 years and work in a which is what I did. So I was interested in liberation theology from the time that I was in university, actually, in my undergrad. And I went to Peru, and I had the chance, to go to Gustavo Gutierrez's course. I worked in a, barrio on the north coast of Peru, a place called Chiclayo, where I met my future wife, so that was a good thing. And and then I came back and did things with especially got into themes around ecology, but I've always seen the two as actually very interrelated. I don't think we can really, to me, you can't separate ecology and liberation. And hopefully in this talk, some of that will become a little bit more apparent why. But I sometimes like to start off with this graphic. They say we're at a crossroads, and I always think, to me, this kind of thing is the kind of crossroads we're at, because it's not kind of simple choice kind of thing, like which one of these ramps do we get on, and so I like to kind of think about good news and bad news, especially around the ecological crisis. And normally we can think of the bad news pretty quickly, but we know we're in the we just heard this week from the IPCC and about we have 10 or 12 years to turn it around, and we get these messages, and they've been going on for quite a while. So I think we kind of know the bad news in that way. But it's not that we don't understand how to get to where we need to go. This isn't really a question of technology. I mean, sure, technologies could always be improved. I think those who are doing research and solar panels or alternative energy or alternative agriculture, all that stuff is great. I'm really glad they're doing that. But it's really not, and we even have a good idea of what kind of policies might get us there if we would just implement them. We have a good idea of what kinds of practices. So it's not really a lack of knowledge. It's not that we lack knowledge here. For years, Lester Brown was putting out this Plan B, and he did all these different versions, and he showed he gave kind of very concrete steps of how this could be done. And there are lots of other people who have come up with these things. So just to say, it's not like we don't know how we might get there in terms of the kind of technical or political types of policies we need. But the bad news is that we're not acting on it as a whole. I mean, certainly some people are, but kind of the collective political will, in fact, right now, the collective political will of anything seems to be less than maybe it was 8 or 10 years ago, which is kind of a scary thing. Not everywhere, once again. I think in different parts of the world, in some places, there are some good things happening. But, so I always like to kind of think that this isn't so much a question of lack of knowledge, it's more of a lack of wisdom. We have a wisdom problem. And so this book that and I won't be like talking about the Tao of liberation all the time, but the way we kind of framed that was seeking wisdom in a time of crisis, because I really think that a lot of it is a lack. Collectively as a species, we're showing a lack of wisdom. And of course, understanding that most of the problems are actually caused by the richest 20% or so of us, and even more so probably by the richest 1%. So, basically 80% of the consumption by 20% of the people. So, and Albert Einstein, and I'm sure all you will have heard this, this idea that we can't solve the problems at the same level of thinking that actually created them. So more of the same kind of thinking probably isn't going to get us there. Or more of the same way of doing isn't going to get us there. So I think in all of this, the importance of stories, I'm going to be talking, I do a lot of teaching around stories and worldviews. And not to say that changing the story changes the world. It's not that simple. I mean, changing the world also changes the story. But we do tend to try to make sense of the world via stories or narratives. And the largest of those are our cosmologies. And also that wisdom is often transmitted through stories, but not only wisdom. I mean, there's also a lot of very destructive stories out there. But we do tend to they're like shortcuts of the brain or something. I think this is how we tend to organize and make sense of things. So we have to kind of understand what are some of the stories out there. And this one I often like to draw on the work of John and Macy, which is kind of the 3 stories of our time, because I think it helps us think about this. So the first one is the one we're probably most familiar with. The Industrial Growth Society, business as usual. Which basically would say something like this. And you all have heard this story in different versions. So, sure there are problems. Of course there's problems. But, we live at the best time ever. I mean, the miracles of capitalism, we have more stuff than ever, more technologies. 100 years ago, no one could have imagined this. This is great. I mean, look, you can go out, you can go to a shopping mall like this and just find just about anything. Just shop your heart's content. We're coming out with technologies. Just gotta have faith in the market. Have faith in the system. Maybe we need to privatize more stuff. Maybe that's why we're not getting there. If we would just adopt more market-oriented solutions, we'd all be okay. And yet, I think probably everyone in this room knows that this is a pathological system. And when I say pathological, it has the logic of pathos, the logic of suffering. So it impoverishes the earth, and people really the large majority of people in the world are also impoverished along with the earth just to accumulate this fictitious thing we call money. And really, most of the wealth is accruing, obviously, the upper 20%, upper 10%. The further up you go, the more it's accumulating, and the rest either aren't moving ahead or they're going backwards. And think about cancerous growth. So I came up with this example recently. I'd seen something like this, but I just did the calculation myself. If we think that growth is normal, we think the idea of an economy growing along at 3% a year, that's not too much, is it? 3% a year? Now just do this little thought experiment. They say in ancient Rome in the year 1 AD, the average per capita GDP was probably about $800 per person. Apply a 3% growth rate, and nowadays that per capita GDP would be 6.5 times 10 to the 28th. It's pretty obvious that we can't keep growing the economy forever.
Can you just break that down? I didn't follow you.
Pardon?
Can you just break down the math? I didn't follow you.
Well, I put this in an interest calculator. You know, like if you take the sum 890, you put in one of those interest calculators at 3% growth a year, that's where it would go. It's this exponential growth. Exponential growth just keeps on, it becomes wild. You know, for the first 10 or 15 years, it might look reasonable, even for 50. But I mean, we can't keep on, you know, if this was the actual per capita income of everyone on Earth, we'd need, I don't know, we might need the whole galaxy to you know, there's just no way. Basically, we need to, you know, a logic of growth is actually going to be this logic. You know, it's just taking all this. I mean, I think that the image really probably says more than my words. That's what we're doing. And obviously, this stuff is going to relatively few people at the same time. And in the end, when all of this is gone, all of that is going to be worthless. It's the other thing. You know, so we have an idea that, you know, cutting down a forest or creating a mine is somehow development. I mean, what is it? That's destruction. You know, the domination of large corporations, I think they say that there's something like 60 corporations which probably account for 50% of greenhouse gas emissions in the world, which just kind of gives you, you know, this idea of finance that just is like a big global casino that people make profits off of money at real cost, though, and kind of a monoculture of the mind, kind of the dominant Western, you know, US, European kind of thought. And more than anything, we understand power as domination, as kind of like as empire, as exploitation as well. So, I mean, you could go on and on about this, but just to say that business as usual really is not a viable alternative. I mean, it leads to destruction. It's already destroyed. And I think this also sums it up. You know, yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. And you know, you saw this report out about a week or two ago that says that climate change, from some U.S. department that said, you know, there's going to be 7 degrees of global Fahrenheit of global warming by the end of the century, but there's nothing we can do to stop it. So that exactly seems to encapsulate that logic. Like, let's make as much money as we can before, you know, the game stops. And so another way of understanding this, the second narrative, which actually makes a lot, is really just the flip side of the first, is that of the great unraveling, which is, you know, a world of deepening ecological destruction, climate change, and also deepening poverty and violence, and all those things is being interconnected. And we know that things like climate change or flooding or pollution tend to affect the poorest. And those who pay the costs are the agricultural workers using the pesticides in the field. You know, it's the same, both the earth and people are paying the same price from the same logic. So that too is a very real, and you know, we know we've already kind of reached beyond the limits of biodiversity lost. At climate change, we're at a key tipping point. Nitrogen cyclone, a lot of these other things. Ocean acidification is another particularly scary one that doesn't get talked much about, but you know, it could be, we acidify the oceans to the point that phytoplankton can't survive anymore, and that's where most of our oxygen comes from. So this is to say, you know, there are some huge challenges here. But I mean, part of the problem here is that sometimes we think this is unfolding slowly. You know, we don't kind of realize it, because our lives are pretty short. So just imagine for a second that the Earth was only 100 years old. How would kind of the timeline go? Well, life would appear pretty fast, I think, probably in the year 20 or even 15, but more recently, the dinosaurs just went extinct 17 months ago. Humans appear on the scene 2 days ago. Yeah, that's how cities appeared an hour ago. The time of enlightenment, quote unquote, and conquest, 6 minutes ago. And most of the, since World War II, the most rapid destruction since about 1950 is the last 45 seconds. From 45 seconds out of a century. So if we're thinking about this in terms of a human lifetime of 80 years, that would be the last minute of one's life. What happens? Well, and this, when I say we, I do say maybe the richest 20% of us, or maybe the richest 10%. What have we done? Destroyed half of all forests, greatly increased greenhouse gas emissions. So it went from, I think, what was it, 250 or 60 to 310, climbing up toward 400 quickly. Ocean acidification's gone up 25% in that time. We put tens of thousands of new chemicals into the air, water, biosphere. Most of these toxic, we don't really know all the effects. At the same time, we've created radioactive waste, which will be around longer than humans have been on this planet. And we somehow think we can manage that. And we've destroyed tens of millions of species. I think every day, I don't know, it's like, there's different ways to calculate this, but we're losing lots of species every day. We don't even know how many species there are. So, when you think about that, I don't know about you, but I feel that, there's a lot of loss happening of human lives, but of lives of countless of species. And Thich Nhat Hanh says, what we most need to do is hear within us the sound of the earth crying. And I think that's true. We have, and I think of a lot of the reactions, I'll try to go on this, a lot of the reactions we see of fear and things are kind of a way of trying to avoid suffering. The suffering is real, and some people can't avoid suffering. Probably 80 or 90% of the world doesn't have the means of avoiding the suffering very easy, but those of us who can tend to try to close the blinds and pretend it isn't happening. But there's different ways of reacting to that. But really, can we hear the cry of the poor, and can we hear the cry of the earth together? Which is in the Pope's encyclical that Laudato Si said that really, Laudato said, I think maybe, but the words flipped around about 10 or 15 years before that we need to learn to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, and realize that really they're one and the same. We as humans aren't separate from this wider web of life. And the third possible narrative, and the one that I think we always have to keep in mind, is this idea of the great turning. The idea that another world is possible. This was actually at a meeting of social movements in Latin America in 2009 in Cochabamba. And, the South American presidents were there too. I mean, actually Chavez was there, and the vice president, Lula wasn't there, but the vice president of Brazil was there. Evo Morales was there. But what was really incredible were these social movements from all over the continent that were gathered there. But I think, I don't know if you people have seen this thing that Paul Hawken does about passing the list of social movements. Just to pass the list of the ones we know about takes something like 2 months, passing them rapidly. And there's a huge amount of social movement response to these issues all over the world. So it's not to say that, the one way we're in dire straits, and another way there's lots of great stuff happening. It is a good news, bad news story. But I think, to keep in mind of all that creativity. And I also want us to think about the possibility of even moving beyond those kind of human social movements to how can we collaborate with the earth itself. So, looking at this, this is kind of the kind of Club of Rome thing, but 20 years after they did these projections, and they were actually pretty well on track with a lot of things. But basically they show that, if we keep business as usual, somewhere around 2025, 2035, everything starts going down. Human welfare, life expectancy, food, population. The problem is right now we're still on the up, and so we don't really feel what's happening. And until we start feeling the decline, it's sometimes kind of hard to know that unless you're on the margins and are already feeling that. But at the same time, they said, you know, that there was a possibility of using both policy instruments and really trying to, you know, reduce the human footprint using best technologies and policies. That yes, you know, it's not without any dips, but yes. But of course, what happens is the longer we delay the changes we need, the bigger those dips get. So I don't know if these same projections were done now, what they would look like exactly.
When did you say? Oh,
that was 2004. I also want to, but I think part of it, just to say at least part of the problem, yeah, changing your perspective changes your experience. I think part of this, I always like to flip this around too, that we also need to change our experience of the world so we can change our perspective. Yeah, I think that there's this idea about worldviews. There can be this kind of idealistic idea of worldviews. I mean, a lot of my academic work is based, you know, worldview and ecological wisdom. There's a really idealistic way that, you know, if we just change our assumptions and the way we think about the world, everything will magically change. No. I think worldviews are embodied and they come through practice. And so we actually have to change our experience to change our worldview. And systems and worldviews reinforce each other. So you really have to be working on changing both at the same time. So when I talk about changing the story, I'm not saying you just have to change the story. I just say that that's a dimension of what we have to change systems, we have to change practices, and at the same time we have to be changing the story. And just, I want to just say something here. A link between emotional bond to the more than human world. There are quite a few studies that show, you know, they did these things where they tried to correlate what's the relationship between a change in worldview and actual action for sustainability. And if it's just about the beliefs, the correlation isn't there. But if it's more about the emotional bond that people actually feel to nature, the more than human world, then there is a much stronger correlation of people actually being able to, but they have to kind of feel it deeply. And so, you know, this has to be a change of heart, you know, metanoia. That can't just be a change of thought. And I think really here are one of the key questions is about separative consciousness, which plays out in all sorts of things. But, you know, do we see the world like this? Not only you'll notice with this diagram, it's not only creatures down here, you also notice that, and you could obviously, people of different social classes, and it's the same kind of logic of hierarchical domination, or do we understand this as an earth community of which we're a part, or as Leopold was talking about, as being plain citizens of this wider earth community. So in thinking about this, it's a little bit of background. Buddhist psychology, I think, can be useful here. What happens when we're confronted with something fearful? And the Buddhists talk about three poisons. One, you know, in general, the Buddha was concerned about how do we overcome suffering? But dukkha is really anxiety, dissatisfaction, suffering, the inability to be happy. How do we do that? And the three poisons he mentions that keep us from doing that. The first is fear. There's a lot of fear out there right now, somewhat understandably for the situation that we're in. But, you know, often that gets manifested as denial, but it can also be in things that are even scarier, and I'll get into that. You know, kind of reactions of scapegoating and things like that. One is addiction, of which the main one of this in North America or European society is consumerism. So we go out and buy something to make us feel better. And that, keep in mind, what I want to keep in mind is that the kind of dominant systems actively reinforce these. I mean, they've used Buddhist psychology in reverse on us. Brilliant. You know, so they keep us fearful. They try to, you know, scapegoating, all those types of things. Addiction, you know, just go out and buy something, keep consuming, and obviously there's addictions to drugs and alcohol and all those other things. And delusion. The delusion that we're separate. You know, so someone was talking about individualism, is separative tendency that we're going to protect ourselves from suffering by separating out. Of course, all these things actually make the situation worse. They actually drive suffering in the logic of the system. So I have a quick video here I want to show about from, some of you will have seen, Charles Eisenstein, who talks about these kind of stories. So just kind of want to think about these two stories and how they might manifest. And in doing that, have any of you ever seen this thing of theory U? Okay. That basically there's kind of these two ways of reacting to change. And one is this kind of denying, desensing, absencing, diluting, disembodying. You kind of get the sense. This is kind of the way of the three poisons, I think. Entrenching, holding on, manipulating, abusing. And we're seeing a lot of this, right? But the other way would be, trying to open to change, sensing, presencing, trying to let something new come and bringing forth something new. So this is kind of a way toward healthy transformation, and this is, the destructive one. And I think what we're really seeing to some extent in the play of these two stories are these two different dynamics. I'll just.
Can you go back actually real quick?
I think we're going to give everyone these slides, but I'll Sharper. You can look at Theory U online, and I think it's an interesting way of understanding this.
Go back to the previous slide, 1 second.
Okay, this slide?
No, the one before. The one before that, sorry. There we go, thank you.
Okay, you will have these. I want to, I'm just aware of our time, I want to give us some time outside.
Yeah, we are building a list of resources that include the presentation, so you should not be worried about it.
So I want to do is just touch.
So I have a name for two of these really deep stories. One of them is the story of the self. The other is the story of the people. All cultures have a story of the self and the story of the people. They answer the questions, who are you? Where did we come from? Where are we going? What's important in life? What's valuable? What's the purpose of life? Different cultures answer these in different ways. The story of the self answers, who are you? What is a human being? And it says, in our civilization, it basically says this. What you are is this separate being among other separate beings in a universe that's separate from you. What you are is this bubble of psychology floating around. This depends. Religion says what you really are is a soul. You're not even the flesh. You're separate from that. You're separate from matter. You're a soul encased in flesh. Science says, well, it's more like you're a consciousness. Descartes would say that. You are this mote of consciousness inside a robot made of flesh. You are a mind inside flesh. Some science would dispense with the mind altogether and say you are just this robot made of flesh. Physics says you are a collocation of atoms, of elements interacting according to various forces. Economics, of course, says that you are an economic man, an atomic unit that interacts with other atomic units according to various forces. So they all agree on what a person is. But not every culture agreed about that. Some cultures would say that what you are is the totality of all your relationships. And they wouldn't even have a word for self that meant anything like our word for self means. They wouldn't have a word for body either. That was different from person. This myth of the separate self, runs very deep. And even though I think most people kind of reject it now, and we're more attracted to the idea that we're, in some sense, we're in unity with each other, that I'm not different from you. Maybe we're even the same being looking out through different eyes, and we're not separate from other species, and not separate from the world. We still have a lot of habits of thought and intuitions that are based on separation. This corresponds in our economic system to the externalization of costs. It says we can somehow insulate ourselves from what's going on out there, because out there is not in here. Out there is not me. So there could be some tragedy. Fukushima, okay? Well, that's not going to affect me because that's over in Japan, and if the wind blows the wrong way, I can go somewhere else. And I can eat food that's imported from somewhere with no radiation. So I can escape that. The Gulf oil spill, well, I get my shrimp from the West Coast. I don't get my shrimp from the Gulf of Mexico, so that doesn't affect me. So our logic says that what happens to you doesn't matter to me. What happens to the world isn't happening to me. That's what our logic says. But our hearts disagree. This logic contradicts our felt experience. So I might as well mention that the new story of self that we are entering, you could call it the connected self. Even that doesn't quite get at it, because that implies separate beings having connections. Really what it is the self of interbeingness, of interexistence, that understands that what's happening to the Gulf of Mexico, what's happening to children in Haiti, what's happening to child soldiers in Africa, what's happening to people living in ghettos, and what's happening to the whales, and what's happening to the forests, that's happening to me too. That's something we can feel. That's why it hurts when you see that photo of the seabird drenched in oil staggering along the shore, or when you read about children in Haiti eating dirt because they're hungry, or when I was driving from Athens and there's those clear cuts, you can see them from the road. Like, that's painful. Why should that hurt? The logic of separation says that there's no reason for that to hurt. But as we enter this new story of self, which you could call the connected self, then it makes sense now. It makes sense why those things should hurt me, because they are happening to me.
Another take on quote, we are here to awaken from the illusion of our separateness. And I think that if we want to kind of move toward liberation, that really is a key thing we need to do, both separation from each other as people, but also from the more intimate world. Rainer Maria Rilke, the poet, some of you will have seen the first
Could you use the microphone, please?
Oh, yes. So Rainer Maria Rilke, in particular, the poet, some people will have seen this first part more likely, but he said that if we surrendered to Earth's intelligence, we could rise up rooted like trees. I like the second part as well. Instead, we entangle ourselves in knots of our own making and struggle lonely and confused. I think separation at the same time is disempowered. At the one hand, we protect ourselves by separating. We try to avoid pain and fear and these different things by separating. But at the same time, someone like Joanna Macy would talk about, this connectedness is the source of true power, especially if we understand power not as domination, but in the sense of, like in Spanish, where power is poder, or in French, pouvoir, is the ability to be able to do something. And really it's only in that connectedness that we have that. But I'd say connectedness with the human world is part of that. So I'm going to actually take us outside now for some exercise. So it's based on this idea of the skill of ecological perception, which Laura Sewall, an eco-psychologist, writes about, that I think a way of kind of forming this sense of connection is learning to attend, to move beyond the well-trodden paths of the mind, be it beauty, awe, mindfulness. There's actually a lot of studies in neurophysiology now about how we make new connections in the brain. And basically a lot of it has to do with attention. Attention and practice are the two things. And imagination, which is also in here, is kind of a way of extending our attention. So learning to perceive relationships, flexibility across time and space. So we won't be doing too much of that today, but that's another part of it, reperceiving depth. So I think meaning, significance, and intentionality, intentionally using imagination. Many of you will have heard the Thomas Berry quote, the world is not a collection of objects, but it's a communion of subjects. How can we really experience that? How can we experience not only other people as subjects, which certainly we need to do, because often we objectify other people, but how can we also cease to understand trees and insects and even things like rocks as mere objects that we manipulate. So what I'm going to do is have us go outside, and as you go out on the table, there's these, you won't really need these right away. You can actually, if you want, you can actually leave them here for now and come back immediately after we do the first part. Because it might be better not to have these in your hands. I'm going to do a kind of standing meditation first, and then I'm going to kind of send you out to do some connecting. We'll see how the time goes with that, but let's just for now gather out on the lawn here, and we can do the first part.
Tiny moving critter that I eventually determined for sure was a spider. Oh, right. I saw a tiny moving animal that I eventually determined was indeed a spider. It was in the middle of the air, but it was moving so fast that I wasn't sure it was a spider. But then I finally saw the very slender silk. And I also noticed quite far away another strand of silk, which made me think about how the spider defined its space and then sort of was able to create its own world.
So spiders as creators of their own world, that's interesting. Anything else?
I walked past a batch of what I guess is ground ivy, and I noticed something that looked like new growth on it. I walked past it, but then I was drawn back to it. And then, of course, I completely failed in the communication process because I began to say, new growth in autumn? How is that possible? Not knowing anything about plants or anything like that. I'm just me. And so then I reflected, perhaps new growth in the autumn of life is possible as well. So, of course, I turned it all around on myself rather than trying to communicate with it. But I don't know, that was what I experienced.
Okay, anyone else? Yes.
Well, I don't know what it was, but it was a flower. It was a flowering bush kind of plant, and it stopped me because it had blossoms on it, and I stuck my nose into the blossoms, and they smelled really sweet. But in the next instant, I noticed it was such a busy workplace. It had bumblebees, it had smaller insects, it had butterflies, and kind of playing off of what you said, it had all the seasons. It had dead blossoms, it had buds, it had tiny little new leaves, and leaves that were kind of autumn-like, and it just was kind of glorious the way everything was there. But a very busy place, much busier than I first expected. So yeah, it was nice. It was wonderful.
Is there anything else that you would have liked to share?
I was looking at the tree at the back of where we stood, and it had like 2 other trunks coming out of the ground that were different, and the bark was different, but it looked like the leaves were similar or the same in different places. And it went up, those two trunks went up into the tree, and it was like all intermingled, and it was hard to follow where each branch went because they were so intertwined with each other. And I just kind of thought, well, sometimes life is kind of like that.
Yes?
I went to find the tree that was a tree I felt had already reached out to me because I'd drawn it a couple of weeks ago when I arrived here. And that was the first tree I tried drawing. And I hugged it, encouraged by seeing someone else hug their tree and thinking, it's all right to hug trees here, because I'm British. And when I hug trees at home, I usually look around and make sure nobody is watching. Or as I get older, I don't really care if they're watching or not. So I hugged this tree, and my ear was against the tree, and I could hear a heartbeat. And I thought, is that the tree's heartbeat or my heartbeat? And I didn't know, and I thought, oh, it's rather nice that I don't know, because we're communing and we've, in some senses, become one. And then there was, I'm a storyteller, so I've told stories of trees being cut down and screaming, and this green sort of tree nymph, spirit of the tree, appeared and danced. And I know you had said trees don't move, and I thought, he's wrong. So I danced with the tree, but there's nothing.
Trees move, but they don't tend to run away from you. I mean, I think many things can kind of come out of these exercises, and I do have some sheets there if you want to take these. I mean, I've done these a lot with undergraduate students. I actually give this as, this is an assignment option, is for to do these like 5 times in local parks in Toronto, and then get their journal reflections. But I don't think, one way they're very simple. I'm sure there's lots of other practices that could lead to the same thing. But I think somehow this kind of need to kind of learn how to have another relationship with beings that are not human, that realize that they can be a source of wisdom, a source of insight, and also, certainly there is that thing. I mean, I often get from the students, so by doing this, I feel more calm, I feel less anxious, this is me really, I mean, it's true, it's good for us in that way, but, not to do it so much from a thought of what I can get out of it, but how can this kind of change my experience of the world? And how can we kind of overcome that kind of anthropocentric way of kind of thinking that we're the center of it all? And just, when you begin to observe something like the bark of a tree and really kind of these kind of miniature worlds, which are and trying to change our perspective and how we see them, and then as some were saying, that the sheer kind of life and energy and all these things. I think it is a source of as humans we evolved in community with other living beings, and I think we really can't be fully human without that. And maybe part of the kind of violence and things that we're seeing in the world today, I think part of it is related to that kind of growing separation. This is, some of you will have seen this. Mike Eckert said, every creature is full of God and is a book about God. If I spent enough time with the tiniest creature, even a caterpillar, I would never have to prepare a sermon. So full of God is every creature. And I think it's, if you want to kind of put this in a more, I kind of formulate these exercises to use in a secular university and things, but certainly this can be reframed in much more kind of theological language. And actually, once again, I was looking, in August I was doing some talks related to Laudato Si, and some of this can be found in there as well. There's some of this kind of similar, I don't think Meister Eckhart is quoted there, but some similar types of thoughts, this idea of kind of the book of creation and learning how, I would say not necessarily read the book of creation, that sounds like we're too much in control. How can we listen to the book of creation? How can we be transformed by the book of creation? So when we think about ecology, I think it's an interesting word. Often it refers to relationships between organisms and their surroundings. That's the more scientific understanding. But we could also just understand it as this kind of study of what is the nature of interrelationship, of interdependence. And of course there's this thing of oikos, the home, or the logic of the home. More than the study, I like the idea of logos as being the logic or even the wisdom of the home. Wisdom of the earth itself. And in kind of thinking about changing our worldviews, what would make a worldview ecological or not? I think for me, fundamentally, it's this idea of switching from this idea of collection of objects to a communion of subjects and really focusing more on relationships. Now, obviously, then, ecology can include the human, and it also includes our human relationships. It includes our relationships with all living beings, including humans. But where relationship is primary over, let's say, accumulation of stuff or exploitation of natural resources. I mean, think about the language we sometimes use. We call a forest a natural resource, not a community of life. We talked, even the word environment kind of implies something separate from us. So for me, it's a worldview that promotes harmonious, sustainable, regenerative relationships among humans and the wider Earth community. That certainly includes relationships between humans, but that's not stopped there. It's all our relationships, it's all our relations. Like how can we have healthy, just, sustainable, life-giving relationships. Now, in terms of liberation, part of what Leonardo Boff and I tried to do in the Tao of Liberation was rethink this idea of liberation, or think about the different meanings of liberation. So, there's the kind of personal, kind of more spiritual sense of liberation, self-realization, purpose, fulfillment, that some people would use. And then there's the social one, from oppression to, freedom from oppression and exploitation. Ecological, I say, toward a world where all humans can live in dignity and in harmony with the greater community of life, the living earth. In Latin America, a lot of the idea of living well is, I think, captures Calzai, Buen Vivir, is really moving toward this ecological sense. But it entails repairing, restoring, regenerating. And could we even think of it as creative participation in the unfolding evolutionary processes of Earth itself? Like, is it furthering or is it countering evolution? If you think about exploitation, it's counter to, this idea that, as I say, clear-cutting a forest, you're taking an intricate, valuable community of life and reducing it to stuff to make furniture out of, or paper, or whatever. But we're almost always taking something of great complexity and reducing it to something simpler and less diverse. Now, some of you will have heard this from Aldo Leopold, who's probably one of the US's most famous ecological thinkers. He said, a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It's wrong when it tends otherwise. And I think that's still a very classic, I think that's a very beautiful articulation. I think I'm going to try to move a little bit beyond that. But I think Leopold, when he wrote, he talked about how, for many years it was kind of accepted in, going back to the Greeks and right into the 1800s, that somehow something like slavery was normal, and it took a while until people realized, hey, ethics doesn't stop with a certain, reduced class of people. We have to extend it wider to all people, which, we still certainly don't practice perfectly, but there would be some philosophical recognition of that. But Leopold was saying, well, now we have to extend that to the whole community of life, the ethical consideration. So, is it possible to think of, how many of you have read things of Thomas Berry and Brian Swim? People familiar here? I mean, in the universe story, they talk about what's called the cosmogenic principle, which is interesting because you can also find there's interesting parallels to this in some of Fritjof Capra's writing on systems. You can actually find it hidden there. And actually I found it in NASA's self-realization, totally different words, but it's actually the same three things that tend to be talked about. And the cosmogenic principle is that the universe tends to evolve toward greater communion, diversity or differentiation, and as well as greater self-organization, creativity, or interiority. Can we think of liberation in those terms? That liberation is a process of moving, so greater diversity, in kind of the typical logic, communion and diversity often don't coexist very well together, but I think authentic communion depends on diversity. Ecologically, a really healthy living system or ecological community has lots of diversity. The greater diversity, the greater its kind of resilience. So that actually true communion depends on diversity. It's not like a monoculture. Monoculture is not really found in nature, or it's certainly not a healthy ecosystem. And at the same time, these kind of dynamics of creativity, interiority, self-organization, can we think of that when we talk about liberation, that's the process of simultaneously, deepening those three. And then, this might seem like a shift, but it really isn't. You can use different words. You can talk about liberation, you can also talk about wisdom. I like to think about wisdom, because as I said at the beginning, I think we really need to think about, we really need ecological wisdom at this time. But just very briefly, I want you to turn to someone next to you and think for a moment of someone you know who you consider to be wise. Now, it could be someone you know in person, or it could be, someone famous or someone you've read about. It could even be a fictional character in a novel. But think about that person, and what is, based on what you know about that person, what is the essence of wisdom? Like, what are the characteristics? So spend a minute doing that, so you don't have a lot of time, but do try to talk with someone next to you to do that.
I'm like all along, so just and it kind of was something we looked at it when follow that person, you really and so it's kind of deeply troubled.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you to start wrapping it up. I know it's not long. But this is just kind of a prelude to a little bit of a brainstorm.
So it's just like
So based on what you've talked about, let's try to name a few key characteristics of wisdom. What makes someone wise? What's a key characteristic of wisdom? Any thoughts on this?
yeah.
So what? Yes.
A depth of human understanding, both good and bad. I mean, and sort of a judgment, but not a negative judgment.
So where do you think is that understanding coming from? Reading books or from experience?
Oh, experience. Well, both. I mean, I'm sure it comes from study, but it also comes
Yeah, always has some experience. It has something about being able to judge or discern.
Yeah.
Just keep those two thoughts in mind. Anything else?
The ability to step outside yourself and to view things with some dispassion.
Yeah, almost to be able to shift perspectives, like a bit to be a shapeshifter, maybe. Yeah, maybe that's a bit of it. Yes?
So, I think we're struggling, or I'm struggling a little bit with the concepts that we're talking about, because it feels like we are ignoring the indigenous knowledge and wisdom that has always been, and we're acting like we're discovering it for the first time, and I'm having a hard time being okay with that in this conversation.
I mean, I think part of that, and right here, would be to say that often wisdom is found in people who are indigenous and living particularly close to that land and have a long tradition.
Yeah, but I think the issue for me is like oftentimes in the white supremacist society that we exist in, it's not valued, and so we're giving it a value from our perspective without acknowledging the fact that that is reality.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that would come also like the question, where does wisdom come from as well, which isn't exactly what I've asked here, but I think that would relate very much that it often comes from long traditional practice, and I would say it also comes not only from humans, but from the wider Earth community, but certainly those who have the longest experience of specific places and specific ecosystems, which tend to be indigenous peoples, often are the ones who would be most deeply immersed in that Earth wisdom.
And are often ignored and
yes.
Right. I just that's
no. I mean, I guess I kind of almost assume that's what, I mean, it certainly needs to be said, but I do kind of acknowledge that. I mean, much of I think where I've learned has been from that as well. Anything else about wisdom, about characteristics of wisdom? Yes?
Long view, which I think also goes with what our previous speaker was saying as a tradition of living in a community that has a long range view of 7 generations behind and 7 generations forward. A long view.
Yes.
Anything else that occurred? So some of the ones, I mean, some of these have that it tends to be experiential knowledge, and I hear drawing particularly on the indigenous medicine wheel, actually, that in North America, and the correspondences can be different in different cultures, but has mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual dimensions. relate it to compassion, generosity, and insight. That one wasn't mentioned, but I think we'd all agree that someone could be have lots of experiential knowledge, but if they're using it to do harm, we wouldn't consider that wisdom. Humility knows limits, balance. It includes unlearning as well as learning. And this actually comes from an Inde elder, the idea of a smooth mind, which is the ability to kind of maintain a certain, it's not dispassion, but it's not being able to get rattled when you have a difficult situation, to still be able to kind of maintain enough peace within that to actually be able to act. Seeing wider patterns, being more relational, intuitive, so not kind of getting lost in the details, and tends to be geared toward action, to actually living well once again, which is once again like Sumat Kasai. So how can we actually flourish? And that was also could be found actually in the Greeks among Phronesis, also had this same idea of wisdom has to do with the flourishing of life. So I mean, I think actually wisdom is found throughout all the different cultures and religions of the world, certainly in indigenous cultures, but also in many religious traditions, which often draw on ancient wisdoms as well. So, in terms of earth wisdom, Raymond Panikar, who was a kind of a very interesting theologian, kind of mixed Spanish and Indian background, and drew a lot on Hinduism as well. He said that in terms of ecological wisdom, it's not just wisdom about the earth, but it's also the wisdom of earth herself, which discloses unto us once we're open to understand it and stand under the spell of what she is revealing to us. And certainly, once again, I'd acknowledge that traditional ecological knowledge, much indigenous knowledge, has tended to come precisely from that very close interaction and daily living with earth wisdom. I also just want to relate it briefly to a few other words. Dao, in terms of the Chinese, the way, walking wisdom that concretely guides us to action. So the idea of kind of a walking wisdom, it's the ideogram. In Hebrew and Aramaic, there's the idea of hokmah, and living knowledge of divine patterns and forces, encapsulating the idea that divine patterns or intentions were hidden beneath the surface appearances, and the wise had to uncover them and transmit them. Malkutat, which is the word that gets translated as kingdom in Greek, had this idea of the ruling principles guiding our life toward the one, unity, non-separation, a fruitful arm poised to create, which enables us to say we can. That comes from Yoda Glasklautz's work. And the idea in Buddhism, for instance, of Dharma, I mean, Joanna Macy would say that's the way things work, or orderly process. I think all these things are related, different ways of thinking about wisdom, that it can be useful. So in terms of ecological wisdom, what I tried to do when in my study with about 24 people, was looking at this definition that ecological wisdom is rooted in a lived experience of the interconnection and intrinsic value of all life, consisting of diverse modalities of perception and consciousness, together with knowledge, skills, and emotional intelligence, that enable humans to listen to, learn from, and attune themselves to Earth's wisdom. And this one came out very, in a lot of the people I talked to, recover a sense of the sacred in life, and then discern and embody actions that seek to, so you remember the thing of discerning actions, as to live well in harmony with each other, other species, respect, protect, and cooperate with life. So here it's not it's actually learning to work with other, like with the greater Earth community. Protect the well-being of future generations, so that long-range thing that was mentioned. Moving toward ever greater justice and equity, and finding satisfaction, fulfillment, meaning, and purpose beyond the quest for acquisition and consumption. So finding other sources of meaning than consumption is being a key one there. So I think when we think about how could we actually develop ecological wisdom, how can we learn to experience that interconnection with different forms of perception and tune ourselves to Earth's wisdom and live well, how can we embody that is a challenge. And I think, certainly we need to draw on all the wisdoms of the Earth at this point in time. And maybe one of the great advantages that we have in this time is there is the possibility of this diversity of wisdoms being woven together and to learn from them. I think, that 100 years ago it would be much harder to have that kind of conversation. And so you can think of wisdom, this is an interesting thing, of wisdom as a process of sensing, minding, and enacting. So it involves how we perceive the world, how we conceive it, but then how do we put it into action, almost as a cycle. So, Zen Master, I came to realize clearly that mind is no other than mountains and rivers and the great wide earth, the sun, the moon, and the stars. So when I did this study, I interviewed 24 people. I was mainly trying to figure out actually how people from kind of the culture of modernity actually could manage to change. So most of the people I interviewed actually were in Canada and the US. I did have, for instance, an indigenous Bolivian activist, and there were people who would not, so it wasn't exclusively that. But I was trying to think, how do people who were not, raised in kind of a culture with strong earth wisdom, ones who had been alienated, how do they actually begin to move toward that? And these are some of the things I actually found. Childhood experiences of place, mentors, guides, opening via attention, beauty. This, in the immersions in alterity, actually the indigenous wisdom did come out very, very strongly in the cross-cultural. But just to say that there are many factors that actually lead to that. And but the importance of connecting to and learning from the more than human world, what we were trying to, I think, do now, tuning and interacting with place, another understanding of science as well, and the importance of engaging in concrete action, work, vocation, purpose. And maybe I'll just end with this one because I think my time is coming to an end. But one of the things I want to kind of that came out for me when I was doing this is that we humans cannot really save the earth by ourselves. I was thinking about this that we saw earlier. I think we can apply this to the earth as well. We need to learn how to work with the more than human world to bring about ecological generation. Rethink science as loving identification with. Biologist Barbara McClintock used to talk about the feeling of the organism. When you think of how indigenous peoples in the Americas did the corn breeding, how did they do that? And there were 1,200 genes changed between teosinte and corn. And one of the many people believe that it's because they entered into a deep dialogue with the spirit of the corn plant, and it was a co-creation between the corn plant and the people. The same with ayahuasca, which I'm not advocating or saying anything for or against ayahuasca, but you have to combine two very particular plants to create ayahuasca. I actually figured out the permutations based on the number of plant diversity in the Amazonian rainforest. There are 800 million possible plant combinations with 2 plants. How did the people find the one that makes ayahuasca? And it couldn't be chance. And what people of that region would say is that the plants taught them. Now that's not the way we tend to think. But I think that's something, yes, that we can learn from indigenous wisdom, is that there is another way. And I think if we really want to heal the earth, if we want to see the earth healed, we have to enter into a co-participatory process of working with other beings, tuning ourselves, what in Taoism is called harmonious or effortless action. It's working with the processes. Versus the kind of Western science, which has had this idea of even putting nature on the rack and trying to extract its secrets. This is a very different way of thinking about that. I'd like to look at that, but what I just want to say, I'm going to flip through all these quickly. One final example to see what's possible. Anyone, this is the lowest plateau of China. Any idea how long it took to go from this to that? Any guesses? How long did it take them to restore an area that over 2,500 years of agriculture had eroded to this state, and to get to something like that? Any ideas?
20 years.
20 years, that's one guess.
1 generation.
1 generation.
8 to 10.
Pardon?
8 to 10.
8 to 10? 8 to 10 years? Is about 10 years. What I want to say is that there are actually all kinds of these examples, and I'll publish them in the slides, you can go look at them, of things where amazing things have happened where people actually start working co-creatively with nature. There's someone in Brazil, Centropica, who restored a piece of the rainforest in the northeast. There's a man in Burkina Faso who basically has pushed back the desert, mainly due to one person's effort, but working with his community. Whole large-scale things. What I want to say is that I think ecological regeneration, or what we could call regenerative liberation, is possible. I'll actually just go back to this one. That really, we have to go beyond thinking about green or sustainable to really thinking about healing the earth, but with the earth, and in appropriate participation in design as parts of nature. I think that that's really the key to both regenerative liberation and ecological wisdom. So I'll stop at that. Thank you.
Do you want to invite for some one question or two?
I can take questions. I just know I'm over time. So.
I don't know. I leave it to you. Yeah, go ahead.
I really appreciate the grounding of this talk in how we listen to and be in community with the earth. I'm just struck with being in the shadow of National Indigenous Peoples Day, in the US at least, and the fact that we're on Turtle Island, and so we're talking about this conversation in a particular social context, right, geographic context, and the ways indigeneity has been, because we have actively ignored and silenced that voice, we find ourselves where we are today. And so I'm learning how the academic exercise of ecological studies reconciles themselves with sometimes the appropriation and theft of the wisdom of indigeneity, and how do we make peace with the ways that we're now trying to essentially rectify what probably we wouldn't find ourselves doing if we had listened to that wisdom to begin with. So how do you, as a Canadian, because I know you have your own work with Indigenous peoples that you're doing, how do you find yourself rooting that work of liberation in that context?
Yeah, I mean, right now, I think everyone is having to work. I mean, it's true what you're saying. I mean, I know in my own current study, I'm looking at kind of regenerative agriculture and ecological wisdom, so I'm trying to make sure to include some specific projects which include very, indigenous peoples and indigenous wisdom within that. I think that, my own study, a lot of, when I'm cultivating ecological wisdom, I did draw a lot on indigenous thinkers as well, because I think they are key. It's a delicate thing because one doesn't want to appropriate, and yet you also want to listen to and incorporate those voices in one's studies. So, I just try to do it by reproducing things that I've seen for them that seem to fit. I don't know if that's always the best way of doing it. I think in the longer term, the question is how we kind of enter into, kind of land-based practices even, and trying to recover it. And I think there's a challenge even within academia in Canada, at least right now, there's a challenge that, there's a lot of trying to hire. I think the ways that universities are trying to do is and I'm just a postdoctoral researcher, I'm not a main professor or anything like that. But I think there's an attempt to hire Indigenous scholars, which is great, but I think it has to go a lot further than that. I think that's a good step. But then there's tremendous demands put on those scholars at the same time, to where they're supposed to be everywhere. So I just did a class in my ecological worldviews class about Indigenous worldviews, and I tried in the past to get guest lectures, but it's very hard, and there's lots of. So I just used lots of video clips of Indigenous people that I could find and tried to share that, so I wasn't talking about it. But I think we have a challenge at this point of trying to really take that seriously without also, then putting huge demands on sometimes relatively few people. So I think it's a great question. I don't think I have the whole answer by any means.
We can take one more.
In Canada, I think our National Aboriginal Day is actually June 24th, which is different. And we don't celebrate Columbus. We never had a Columbus Day celebration. So I just recently was hearing here that you celebrated on that day. In Peru as well, Inti Raymi. Well, I think in Canada it's the 21st, in Peru it's the 24th, which is Inti Raymi.
And in many places, the day was changed long time ago to the Culture Day.
Yeah.
In some places, it's the day of the resistance.
Yeah.
In some places, it's the day of the cultural encounter. And we didn't encounter anybody, but it's a celebration that has been transformed in many places, as we have been learning. I know that we don't have more time now, but I highly would recommend that people ask you about el buen vivir, because I think that you touch about that within the presentation, and it's one of the great learning that not just within the scholar work is being recuperated, but many communities around the globe are saying, what? This is a tradition that has been, for so many years. The ethical dimension of this is what we think can save where we are right now. And I think that there is a lot of opportunity for this. And we know that you can take it, Vandana Shiva in India, you can take Ngari Matai when she was alive, planting trees, many expressions of indigenous knowledge, as you said, in practice, that came from I am in relationship with this being that we call Earth, is important. And I think that el buen vivir is something that we need to touch and elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, and I would say that actually a lot of what inspired me to get involved in ecology, I think I didn't even realize at the time I was simply living in Peru for 8 years and spending time walking in the mountains in the indigenous areas and kind of seeing a different kind of relationship. It was kind of like a subtle thing that just kind of sank into me, I think, at the time. But I don't consider myself only I came into academia relatively recently. I'm not only an academic, and so it came out of that experience.
Yeah.
So, anyhow, thank you very much.
I invite everyone to go outside during the break so we can reset the space.